So the object of this is, how do we end wars? And what I'm going to try to do is just give you the theoretical framing in international relations and political science into which most military doctrine now buys into, at least in the West and probably in the East as well, and try to provide an alternative interpretation of what's going on in terms of human conflict. The overriding theoretical goal prior to this, through previous Minerva research and research at Crick, has been to determine the relative contributions of material interests, cultural values, and group identities in initiating, sustaining, and terminating conflict and war, and the collective security arrangements between nations. And there's Lydia. Our multidisciplinary, multinational teams of academics, policymakers, former military, playwrights, poets, explores why people refuse political compromise, why they go to war, why they attempt revolution or resort to terrorism, focusing on what Darwin called virtues highly esteemed and even sacred that give immense advantage to any group inspired by devoted individuals willing to sacrifice for them, and which allow low power groups in evolutionary struggle to dominate high power groups under certain circumstances, that is, if they have these devoted actors to inspire others. So we were at the forward lines of Mosul in 215 and 216, running experiments here with PKK, which is on America's terrorism list, just like ISIS was. And interestingly, although most of the insights comes from work with ISIS and PKK, the United States is loath to learn lessons from them precisely because they're on the terrorism list. I actually wanted to play this if we can. How do we play it? Can you play that? To show Lydia and Ho Shang actually doing field work on the front lines in Iraq.
Have I seen this? I don't think I've seen this.
Just click on the arrow there. Yeah. There's no sound here. Could you? What happened to that? That disappeared? There we are again. Just what research in the wild looks like. So this is about 1.5 kilometers from the ISIS lines on the Mahmoud front. In this little cabin is Lydia and Ho Shang, wonderful guy, also a playwright, great Arab playwright. And they're doing experiments on the will to fight, why people fight, why they're willing to fight and die and make sacrifices. Using materials we developed, these are just paper and pencil materials, sometimes we use dynamic materials on the iPad or iPhone. Just to give you an idea what anthropological field work looks like in the wild. Okay, next slide. I'm not embarrassing you. Lately we've been in Ukraine. We've set up field hospitals. Artists have set up field hospitals along the Polish-Ukrainian border. That's Decker. He's our head of medical research. He's done some wonderful work around the world in Iraq and Haiti and other places. I feel like Chancey Gardner. Okay, what kinds of things do we do to get at the questions we're interested in? Well, we do experiments like you saw in the field. We do online experiments. We do lab and brain scans. And why do we do these things? Well, the reason we go into the field is because the biggest problem in social science is the difference between what people say and what they'll do. And especially with regard to conflict and war, how do you know what they say is what they'll do? And the best way to do that is to go to the battlefield and see what they do and count casualties and things like that. But another way to do it is to monitor their brain functioning, brain processing, to see if certain behaviors, like behaviors with respect to material interests, are different with respect to, say, sacred values, and to see if there's a consistent difference, to rule out posturing again. You cannot voluntarily want your brain to function in a certain way rather than another. So that's why we do brain scans as well. And of course, doing these things brings out discoveries through serendipity. For example, we find that joy and revenge use the same neural networks, which is an interesting discovery, because what that implies is that the joy you have, or the revenge you have, say, for suicide bombing, and the joy you feel are very similar to one another. Who do we study? Well, we study all sorts of people. Arms, militia, regular army, guerrillas, supporters, wherever we can. And we embed the different measures in questionnaires. These are dynamic measures. You slide them on a slider. What we do is try to go into the field with small groups of people, figure out what is important to them. We don't come with a priori ideas if possible. See what they're telling us is important to them. Then do experiments with them. Then go back to the lab, design general experiments, do it with general populations, or do it with online with thousands of people to find out if it can generalize. So that's our basic approach. And we try to publish in top science journals, because peer review is the sloppiest, the best way to have your results validated by the community and find out if they're really on target. Okay, so the main research focus that I actually want to talk about, which is the subject of the Minerva proposal, is understanding the subject of will to fight in a quest for ontological significance. Ontological significance involves affirmation of group identities and associated ideals, often held to be sacred and indivisible. And will to fight for ontological significance is resistant to analyses exclusively in terms of the prevailing bargaining and realist theories of war termination that center on belligerents concerned with material fighting capacity and with balance of power. Most in international relations and political science, most theorizing about war is based on bargaining theories and realist theories of war. In fact, since Metternich, they've been mostly based on that. Or you can even say Clausewitz. Now, at the outset of World War II in 1939, the US Army had 174,000 strong, was 19th in the ranking of armed forces. With the US entry into war, Roosevelt committed the nation to unconditional victory over the Axis powers through the generation and application of overwhelming force, reprising in part actions taken by Lincoln to win the US Civil War. Chief of Staff George Marshall, by the end of World War II, was able to bring military forces up 50-fold, and American industrial production doubled, producing 2/3 of all Allied military equipment and over half of industrial production of the world. But regarding Americans' involvement in regional wars since then, in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, this nearly exclusive focus of military capacity to the exclusion of will to fight has been disastrous in terms of costs and treasures and lives, failure of desired outcomes, and this was also nearly the case in Ukraine. For example, on Iraq, in September 2014, which actually started us thinking about this, US President Barack Obama endorsed the declaration of his National Security Director, James Clapper. What we didn't do was predict will to fight. That's always a problem. We didn't do it in Vietnam. In this case, we underestimated ISIL and overestimated the fighting capacity of the Iraqi army. It boils down to predicting the will to fight, which is an imponderable. So the idea is it's so important, but we can't think about it. On Afghanistan, General Milley, this was President Biden. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped the Afghan military force of 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped. A force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for their maintenance of their Air Force. But what we couldn't provide them was the will to fight. In testimony to Congress, General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, the strategic failure of US political and military mission in Afghanistan, noting that the intangible factor of the will to fight was critical to the unanticipated outcome of America's longest war. He said, we can count the trucks and the guns and the units and all that, but we can't measure a human heart from a machine. On Ukraine, testimony of the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency Director, General Scott Berrier. My view was that based on a variety of, I should say, material factors alone, that Ukrainians were not as ready as I thought they should be. Therefore, I questioned their will to fight. That was a bad assessment. And in fact, it almost sunk Ukraine because the United States did not initially provide Ukraine with the means to defend itself. So our research offers evidence from the battlefield in Iraq with supporting evidence from field studies, on online studies, and brain studies in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and the US, that will to fight can be and has been a decisive power in allowing low-power groups to persist and even prevail against state police and armies that rely mostly on material incentives like pay, promotion, and punishment. Now, there was a recent article this summer by Stephen Walt, professor of international relations at Harvard, True Realist Theories, and he argued that the enemy of peace really is morality. That once you take into consideration measures of the heart and morality, then you throw true negotiations out the window and you only prolong conflict. The point of view we're taking is that for seemingly intractable conflicts, the reverse is true. The more you take a realist position, the more likely you are to drag out the conflict. So what is realism? Realism is the dominant paradigm, as I said, probably since Clausewitz, at least since Metternich argued that balance of power is the key to maintaining peace in the world after the Napoleonic Wars. There are two types of realism. There's what's called defensive realism, and that is the idea that you simply maintain a balance of power through various institutions and means and balancing of military. But then there's a notion called offensive realism. And for offensive realists, the goal is power maximization, which cannot abide a balance of power or a status quo because of the absence of an effective enforcement mechanism in an anarchic international system. That is, between great powers, there's no one to police anybody because they're all the policemen policing everyone else. And so there's no way to maintain a peace by exogenous forces. And the result is perpetual instability, perpetual conflict, indeed perpetual war. In this view, the Ukraine war seems an inevitable result of the US-led NATO expansion into Russia's former security space when Russia was weak, and where now a reinvigorated Russia is hell-bent on reversing America's opportunistic power play. And there's much to be said for this offensive realist position, as of course John Mearsheimer and others are most commonly associated with them. Yet Mearsheimer and the others, and the other realists, whether defensive or offensive, I think their biggest, let's say, mistake is to deny matters of the heart. There are other problems, for example, believing that states are rational actors rather than the people that comprise the states, and thus ruling out many of the things that go on within states to make the states appear to behave as they do. Now, of course, James Fearon famously argued that whether in interstate or dyadic conflict, if wars are costly, then all things being equal, it's irrational for states to go to war. They should seek out negotiated conflicts. Why then don't they? Thomas Schelling, of course, the Nobel laureate in economics, viewed this as a bargaining process. From this vantage, wars start not because of power lust or anarchy as such, but for lack of information about the true intentions and capabilities of rivals or illusions about one's capabilities, and because of unresolvable doubts about the unenforceable ability of states to make binding commitments. Wars allay these uncertainties and end when these are credibly resolved or reduced. So the theory of war, basically in bargaining realist theories, is when you have the right information to avoid war about others' material capabilities, especially, then war, or when balances can be found within the anarchic system. When those uncertainties are reduced or resolved, there's no need for war, and there will be peace. Of course, that's not the case. Bargaining analyses highlight that there are certain uncertainties concerning military capabilities and willingness to fight. Some of these are based on what Fearon called indivisibles. What's an indivisible? For instance, being pregnant or not is indivisible. You can't be partially pregnant. You either are or you aren't. Having a right to pray or a religious right or a value is individual. But what realist theories and bargaining theories argue is that that's only a pseudo-sacred, a pseudo-indivisible thing. Compromise is always possible around the edges. And in fact, if you look at the history of warfare, things even like unconditional surrender, there are compromises on the basis of all these so-called indivisible values that motivate people into conflict. So when the United States said Japan must surrender unconditionally, except we will allow the condition of the emperor being left in power. I think this is the wrong frame. It's not that they're pseudo-sacred and they're not really indivisible, as even people who've come up with sacred values theories like Phil Tedlock and John Barron have proposed. It's because they're reinterpreted the way religious canons are reinterpreted. People don't believe they compromise over the Ten Commandments when they believe in the Ten Commandments. They reinterpret how they believe in those commandments. What imams and rabbis and prophets and pastors do on their Sunday morning or Saturday morning or Friday morning ceremonies is reinterpret for the audience, give a new context to what these supposedly sacred values are. And that's very different from saying we're compromising over it. We're giving up a piece of ourselves in order to make a deal. So we start with realist theories as a sort of baseline, but then argue these are far from ideals. Not only states are not making decisions, people in the states are making decisions. There are leaders, there are influence groups, there are all sorts of factors moving people. These are treated in realist and bargaining theories mostly in an ad hoc manner, case by case. What we try to do is figure out, are there theoretical underpinnings to these types of influences as well? And we argue that it's not necessarily a matter of territory or of military balance of power, but of gaining ontological significance for the belligerents. So consider China and the US risking war for Taiwan or Russia, and the US risking war over Ukraine. Taiwanese or Ukrainian independence pose no realistic security risk to the territorial integrity or independence of the three great powers. Those internationally recognized borders have never been more secure, despite this tiny incursion into Kursk, which is 0.006% of Russian territory, and certainly not going to be permanently held. On the contrary, continued conflict only further risks endangering the security of each power. But even if Taiwan and Ukraine were to disarm, conflict would persist likely, because material security considerations are not the engine of great power politics. Rather, driving policy are issues of respect, of honor, of national significance, of dignity, of historical grievance, along with the sentiment on all sides that the core values of democratic liberalism are largely incompatible with autocracy in the competition for global influence. Well, why do we remember these things in the history of war? Why do we remember Thermopylae and Masada and the Alamo or the Tres de Mayo in Madrid? Why are these things so important for history and for our understanding of the history of war? Much more so than even the great battles like Cannae or Waterloo. And that's because it sends a message about what's important in life for the belligerents. Human beings act and make their greatest exertions, even in peace, in the creation of pyramids or in great monumental works, as in war, based on what Thomas Hobbes called that privilege of absurdity to which no creature but man is subject. That is, the idea of who and what we are, what significance we have in this world beyond our mere physical existence at this moment. So our studies suggest that unconditional cooperation and intractable conflict are best understood within a devoted actor rather than rational actor framework. And this integrates research on core cultural values and spiritual moral strength, whether religious or secular, with trust and identity fusion with a cause or a group, which gives a visceral sense of oneness and invulnerability to the group. Now, most military doctrine analysis of fighting capacity is based on cost imposition. If you look through the national security strategy of the United States, the idea of the United States military in any war, in any conflict, is to impose intolerable costs on the enemy, usually in terms of material capacity and ability. Now, much more is known about the costs, the economic decision-making, than value-driven behavior. But suicide bombers, just for an example, are willing to sacrifice the totality of their self-interests, even those of their family and their community if necessary, at whatever costs. Now, these are features of the sacred values which violate the basic axioms of most utility theories, most theories of marginal utility. They're immune to material trade-offs. Most people wouldn't sell their children or sell out their country or religion for all the money in China. Now, of course, in standard economic theories and of their derivatives in military and political doctrine, anything is fungible. I would sell or trade off anything for anything else under the right conditions. They're insensitive to temporal or spatial discounting. Distant events and places are more valuable than here and now. Think of the Exodus from Egypt or the Second Coming. You know, a bird in hand is worth more than two in a bush. Those are basic tenets of economic theory and even political theory. They're resistant to social pressures, unlike norms that represent and yield to social consensus. Doesn't matter what the people around me think. I believe them because it's the right thing to do, and I'll die to do it. And they generate actions independent of prospects for success, just because it's the right thing to do. Now, when you offer material incentives or disincentives like sanctions, when such values and devotions are in play, the effect is usually a backfire effect. That is, the more incentives, positive incentives, or the more material sanctions you impose, the more likely people are to hunker down into their values. And we've done several studies over many years with the person, Khalil, the Palestinian Center of Policy of Survey Research, showing that for Israeli settlers, for example, as for Palestinian refugees, the more you offer material incentives for people to give up things like the right of return or the ability to settle in greater Israel, the more likely they are to oppose their own armies physically. In Iran, we found in all Iranian provinces but two where we couldn't test, 11 to 13% of the Iranian population that supports the hardliners in the regime responded with more support for a nuclear program, even nuclear weapons, the more sanctions ramped up. Here, this is a study we did in Morocco in two neighborhoods, in Casablanca, in the city Moomin, and in Tetuan, in the Jama Mezouai. That's where they produced the suicide bombers who blew up the trains in Spain and then blew up one another. And what we found was those people who have sacred values in terms of their willingness to die for the caliphate, and those people who are most fused with their group, the most identified with their group, maximize their willingness to fight and die. These are two independent predictors. You'll hear from Harvey Whitehouse on Wednesday about fusion. That's one predictor. This is another predictor, sacred values. And when they interact, willingness to sacrifice is maximized. So people are highly motivated to defend their sacred values, especially if they experience identity fusion with groups that promote these values. Now, we've done, of course, brain studies in support of all these field studies and online studies. We've done it with Salafi Jihadism, we've done it with Lashkar Taibi, we've done it with Al-Qaeda affiliates, and we've done it with Spanish far right. Since I sometimes present this to the American military, I can't mention Americans, but we do this with Americans on the far right as well. And when we do brain scans, for example, on issues, this is true for all these communities, willingness to fight and die for sacred values show decreased activity in those parts of the brain associated with utilitarian reasoning compared to the non-sacred condition. And deliberate reasoning. That is, people who are responding to sacred values respond much faster than if responding to conflict or problems that deal with non-sacred values. Why? Because we find that they're associated with the same kind of deontic that is moral reasoning about right and wrong, rule-bound behavior, than with deliberation, with analytically considering costs and benefits. Oh, this is, except unless you're into neural imaging, it's not going to mean that to you. But what we find in general is that people do not make decision costs and benefits part of their calculation when responding to sacred value. Now, why did we start doing these brain scans? This was initially brought home to us in the battle, in a battle of Cadilla, in which Lydia helped to analyze, which occurred as the initial battle on the Mahmur front for the retaking of Mosul. And the American army had trained Sunni militia, the Kurds were in place, and the Iraqi army was in place, and they tried to take this village of Kudilla, which you saw was near those front lines we were talking about. And they overwhelmingly outnumbered the Islamic State. So they attacked, they tried to retake this village, the first village to be retaken on the Mosul front line, and were repelled by the Islamic State. The Sunni militia ran away, the Iraq militia ran away, and only the Kurds came in to save them, and then they pulled back, and ISIS retook the village. And when we interviewed ISIS people as well, captured of course, we found out that the Ingamasi, those who dive in deep, those were the first who penetrate the front lines, were truly devoted actors. They actually believed that what they do and were willing to die at any cost. And we found the only ones willing to resist them were the PKK, who actually were willing to go on the front lines as well and fight to the death for the sake of what they called Kurdeity. And when we interviewed them on the front lines, I remember very well, we were sitting in one of these little huts that you saw, and there was a phone call, and one of the Kurdish commanders started crying. His family was just 1.5 kilometers away in a village controlled by ISIS. And we asked, why are you crying? And he said, because if they find my family with the cell phone, they're going to execute them, and I'm not there to protect them. And we asked, well, why aren't you there to protect them? He says, because this is even more important than my family. So what we find in studies is that around the world, people normally fuse most with their family. They're willing to sacrifice for their family, especially their children. And there are genetic reasons, there are evolutionary reasons for that. You can find consistent evidence that people are willing to die for their children, but not die for their first cousins. They are willing to sacrifice less for their second cousins and their uncles and aunts. Okay? But when sacred values, this privilege of absurdity is in place, people are willing to even sacrifice those who are dearest to them. Now we did another sort of measure. We have many measures, and this is the last measure I'm going to talk about today. And this is a very simple one. So we were with the PKK, and we were with ISIS, and we gave them iPads, and they were to simply evaluate who's physically strong or not by just moving the slider. You get bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. How formidable is the enemy? How formidable is your own side? Interestingly, the American army, the Iraqi army, the Sunni militia, the Shia militia, they all did this experiment instantaneously. We try to do measures that any 12-year-old can understand, and they're pretty valid across any culture. But the PKK and the ISIS people actually threw the thing across the room and said, this is irrelevant. The only thing is what's in their heart, what spirit they have. So we simply came up with a new measure, based on what these guys were telling us, about spiritual formidability. And we asked them to rate the spiritual formidability using the same physical frame. And we found stunning differences. And spiritual formidability was highly correlated with both fusion and sacred values, and predicted willingness to fight and die. Those with the greatest sense of spiritual formidability of their own and belief in the others' lack of spiritual formidability were the most willing, most belligerent, and the most willing to fight and die. So, what are we doing in this project? This is just the background to the project, what we think will help us begin to understand how to end wars. And so we've picked 6 case studies. 3 paired studies. The first study is Russia and Ukraine. And what we found so far is that this is an easier way to, well, wait, why is it going? Can I go back?
Yeah.
So, fusion, which is group, spiritual formidability group, trust in the group, leads to willingness to make costly sacrifices, even for Europeans who support Ukraine. Not in terms of willing to kill one another, but in terms of willing to suffer higher prices, inflation, and actually give money. I mean, physically give money. That's the way we measure it, to the Ukrainian cause. And we find that this sequence of fusion with your group, the belief in the spiritual formidability of your group, your trust in your group, will predict willingness to sacrifice everywhere we've seen. And this includes Palestine, Lebanon conflict, Turkey, even in the UK. And we've since done many other studies, in fact 30 other cultural studies. That was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy. Now the paired study for this is World War II, from the invasion of France or the invasion of the Low Countries in May 1940, to the Battle of Moscow and Pearl Harbor, late 1941, early 1942. Why? Why? Because it looked like Britain and Russia should lose the war. In May, on May 27th, even Churchill believed that only 30,000 people would be recovered from Dunkirk. And there was no way that the British Army was going to be able to go back to Europe for decades to come. He even entertained, not what Lord Halifax did, but even entertained the possibility that they might have to negotiate. But then later in the day he said, no, we will never surrender. Of course, he made that famous speech on the 28th of May. The Russians were even in worse shape. The Russians had lost 3 million men in the first 2 months of the war. 60% of their industrial production was destroyed. In November, there were only 15 tanks left to defend Moscow against thousands of German tanks and armored vehicles. But the Russians didn't give up. And after the Battle of Moscow, things turned just like after Pearl Harbor. R.V. Jones, the legendary head of intelligence for Britain's Air Ministry, the Israelis, by the way, the Mossad gives their annual intelligence prize, called the R.V. Jones Prize, to their best intelligence agents. I'm sure they're going to give it to the pager guys this year. R.V. Jones, his intelligence structure was very much like, he would bring in magicians, he would bring in playwrights, he would bring in poets, he would bring in anybody who could give insight into what the Germans were doing and how to defend them. He said, I used to look at my wall map every morning and wonder how we could possibly survive. Anyone in his right sense would do the best deal he could with Hitler, but we had no thought of it. There was that white glow, overpowering, sublime, that ran through our island from end to end. It must lie very deep down among human motions, at facing dangers in which we may easily perish as an individual, but also a subconscious knowledge that any society which has a high enough proportion of similar individuals is all the more likely to survive because of their sacrifice. And in fact, the Germans upped the ante in the Blitz, and the British people only dug down deeper into their willingness to resist. Wehrmacht General Gunther Blumentritt wrote, he was in charge of much of the offensive operations in the central corridor of Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany in June 1941. He wrote, the behavior of the Russian troops, even in this first battle for Minsk in July 1941, is strikingly different from the behavior of the Poles and the troops of the Western Allies in the face of defeat. Even when surrounded, exhausted, and deprived of the chance to fight, the Russians will never back down. By the way, Himmler had a very interesting response to this. He got a group of German generals together and said, trying to explain Russian resistance, he said that German genealogists had found that Stalin really had German ancestry. And that was the reason. That was, okay, Palestine-Israel conflict, which we've all been working with, onto the Gaza war. And some of us have been working on this conflict and the history of this conflict from the very beginning. I mean, going back into the 19th century and even earlier. Whoops, wrong way. And what we find is, at every juncture, in 1919 rebellion, 1922, 1929, the 1936 Arab Revolt, the 1947, 1948 Nakba and War of Independence, and in every subsequent blow-up, including the Intifadas, the actual triggering mechanism is what's happening at Al-Aqsa Mosque. The belief, whether real or just perceived or just rumor, that one side or the other is trying to take over the holy compound. Every single one. This has become the symbolic knot of the world. I mean, Israel itself has the territory of Sardinia. Yet, whatever happens in Israel and Palestine grabs the headlines of the world's major newspapers and social media everywhere in the world, which represents a really insignificant part of the world's population compared to, say, what's going on in Sudan, in South Sudan. Why is this particular conflict the one the world focuses on? And there's a real tie between why that particular triggering event and why this particular conflict occupies the world's conscience. And again, this is not to be explained in terms of realist theories. I mean, what realist theory is going to tell you why this is the case? Why this apparently insignificant dot on the world's surface is causing such chaos in the world? Oh, this is just... I'm bad at this. I was never a tech person. Okay, this is just the study we did with Khalil, with the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research over many years, involving thousands of participants, using census data and every aspect of the Palestinian Israeli population, showing that for any peace deal, the more you offer material incentives, the more resistance to the peace deal and the more the willingness to fight and die, the more joy at the idea of killing the enemy. It's only when you offer a apology, a readiness to concede, even if you provide no material, we will make sure to emphasize that there was going to be no material trade-off, people's response to belligerency seriously declines. Again, this makes no sense on rational bargaining theories. And I have to very much Javier. Well, we're going to do the Anglo-Irish War. There's our friend up here as the great peace dealer. Also from its very beginnings. And I just want to read you the last part of it. So Danny Morrison, along with Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams, said when the other side's identity, when their rights, when their security, when their fears and institutions they would be prepared to support are taken into consideration, and their religious sensibilities, then we realized peace was possible. Only then, and not before then. Of course, there was the European Union, which gave a framework which the Israeli-Palestine conflict doesn't have, which was very important, and especially the collapse of the Soviet Union, which made the Americans less nervous about the leftist leanings of the IRA, even though the IRA was never communist, had strong sympathies. The last pair is the Chinese-Taiwan conflict and the Spanish-Catalan conflict. Okay, why? Because they're both based on interpretations of their civil war and the idea of who they are. The Chinese, like the Spaniards and the Catalans and the Taiwanese, are in a struggle of who and what they are. Not what territory has, not what chips they can control, not what ships or armor they have, but again, what their identity is. Okay, and this is our last bit. Hassan's going to talk much more about this. We try to implement this in the internet space, where we monitor and how we end wars, because the digital age is different from the other case studies, the historical case studies I was talking about. What we try to do is measure what we call effects through a real-time effects monitoring, where we take messaging, say through Russian bots or Chinese bots or Iranian bots, we figure out which ones are influencing target populations, whether it's the world or the Palestinians or the Israelis or the Europeans. And then we try to show how the stance of people with respect to a war or a conflict changes as a result of change in messaging. And we can do this. We can do this by just monitoring the messaging and building what's called Sankey diagrams to show how certain messages change the flow of information and move people, say, from a pro position to an anti position, or from an anti position to a neutral position. And that's what we're doing with respect also to the Ukrainian crisis and the Taiwan crisis. And the last point is that civilizations rise and fall on the vitality of cultural ideas, not material assets alone. History shows most societies have sacred values that bond people together to passionately fight, even to death, rather than compromise. These were insights from Ibn Khaldun and Arnold Toynbee here in the US. This is a picture I took on the Kalandia Wall in the West Bank of Mahatma Gandhi, where he wrote, "Values become your destiny."